philosophical place dignity and individual at the center of its movement. The primary principle of humanism, I don't need to spell that for you, do I? The primary principle of humanism is that the human beings are rational and have an innate free system for good. Although humanism is associated with the beginning of the Reformation, the humanist philosophy was not new when it became popular in Italy during the Middle Ages. In fact, according to the incredible Protagoras, mankind was the measure of all things, and this idea was echoed by many other wonders of the world, and none so wonderful as mankind. This is classical humanism. Man as the ideal at the center of all creation. Even the ancient Greek gods were viewed as resembling man both physically and psychologically, and in a sense, Aristotle's personification of deity is just another way to exalt human beings, but that aside, it was precisely the rediscovery and translation of a classical manuscript that coincided with the invention of printing presses around the mid-15th century, which provided a catalyst for the humanistic movement throughout Europe. As the clergy and upper classes participated in the rediscovery and dissemination of classical literature, humanism became popular among theologians and scholars, and soon set the stage for the Renaissance. So this one I'll spell. Does anybody remember the meaning of the word Renaissance? Reverse, renewal. Right, your Renaissance literally means reverse, and it refers to the return to ancient Greek and Roman art and literature, which, like all things in the humanistic tradition, they were measured by human standards. Art returned to the classical principles of harmony and balance. In the field of architecture, which both being rigid and secular buildings styled after ancient Roman design, is a mathematical proportions and a human scale that contrasted with the medieval Gothic building of the previous era. Public works such as bridges and aqueducts from the Roman occupation were repaired, restored, or rebuilt. In the sculptures of the period, nude figures were modeled in life-size images with a true proportion, when it was also at this point that realism became the standard for painting, with a preference for naturalistic setting and the placement of figures in realistic proportion to those settings. And aesthetic and artists even produced self-portraits this time. Remember, the figures in the periods of a previous era tended to be of another world, but the Renaissance painters placed recognizable human beings in this world. In music, there was an effort to create harmonies that were pleasing to the human ear, and melodies that were compatible with the human voice. In addition, music lessons became more widespread as a source of education and enjoyment. Dancing increased popularity with a concurrent trend toward music that had rhythm and invited movement as a pleasurable activity. Wasn't that why Latin became so important? Yes, both Greek and Latin became important as tools for scholarship, and classical Latin became the basis for an international language of the intellectuals throughout Europe. To be true to humanism and all it represented, it was necessary to be knowledgeable about and faithful to the ancient philosophers as expressed in their writings, and how best to express them than in the original languages. By the way, Latin as a universal language for politics and aristocracy, this encourages the exchange of ideas on a wider scale than ever before. and legitimize, in a sense, the presumption that mankind was at the center of all things. Uh, Individuals curse to make a name for themselves and establish their place in the history of mankind. Whereas at this time, close association, almost a partnership, was forged between art and science. To be precise, sculptors and painters studied the human form, and in fact they became anonymous. You may recall the drawing in your text by the one Leonardo da Vinci, which demonstrates the geometrical proportion of the human body. And of course, everybody, indeed his many books and sculpture and painting, he emphasized the study of mathematics as the underlying principle of all arts. Whereas artists had considered themselves the craftsmen in the Middle Ages, the great Renaissance artists viewed themselves as intellectuals, philosophers, if we will, of humanism. They were designing a world for human beings to live in and enjoy, one that was in proportion and in harmony with mankind. So, perhaps you can see why the so-called Renaissance man emerged. Okay, but exactly what is the definition of a Renaissance man? And it means a very tender person. Good question. Sometimes we use these terms without really defining them. So I would say that the Renaissance man would be talented, as you said, but would also have to demonstrate a broad interest in both arts and the sciences. The quality that was most admired in the Renaissance was extraordinary, maybe even universality of talents in diverse fields of endeavor. Impressing man in the center of the world as a measure of all things in it. With a humanistic philosophy as a justification, scholars would interpret the ancient classics, and some of them would argue to a reasonable conclusion a very new and more secular society built on individual human effort. It was not difficult for the Renaissance man to make the leap of logic from classical humanism to political humanism, which encouraged freedom of thought and indeed even democracy with both the church and the state. But that is a topic for another day.